Part 1. The punch that started it all. Tara Mitchell had spent 15 years on the force, patrolling the humid streets of Jacksonville with the kind of authority that came from knowing she was in control. She had built her reputation on being tough, on taking command of every situation, on ensuring that people, especially the ones who thought they were above the law, learned to respect her badge. She believed in order, in rules, and in making sure that people followed them. That belief had hardened into something else over time, something sharp-edged and instinctual. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about asserting dominance, making sure people knew where they stood. She had been in enough situations to recognize patterns, to know who needed to be reminded of authority and who would comply without issue. And as she sat in her cruiser that night, the thick Florida air pressing in through the half-open window, she spotted the kind of person who, in her mind, always needed to be reminded. The sleek silver SUV drifted through the dimly lit streets near the pier, its polished exterior gliding past the rundown fish market without so much as a hesitation. It was late. Too late for someone driving a car like that to be in this part of town without a reason. No turn signal. A minor infraction, but one that gave her a reason to check, to make sure. Her fingers twitched against the cool metal of her holster as she reached for the patrol lights, flipping them on and slicing through the night with flashes of red and blue. The SUV slowed, its brake lights glowing in the darkness before it coasted to a stop on the patchy asphalt by the market. The engine idled smoothly, barely making a sound. That alone set her teeth on edge. People who owned cars like this always seemed too sure of themselves, too convinced they had nothing to worry about. She exhaled slowly, savoring the moment before stepping out of her cruiser, her boots striking the pavement with deliberate force. As she approached the driver's side, her shadow stretched long across the hood of the vehicle, the humidity making her uniform cling uncomfortably to her back. The window rolled down with a mechanical whir, revealing a man in his mid-40s, black, with a neatly trimmed beard and a face carved from stone. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, the kind that reeked of expensive taste, the kind she'd seen on attorneys who thought they could talk their way out of anything. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, his fingers steady, betraying no sign of nerves. Tara's eyes flicked to his hands, to his shoulders, scanning for any sign of hesitation, any twitch of movement that would justify tightening her grip on her holster. But there was nothing, just that frustrating, unreadable stillness. He didn't react the way people usually did when she approached. No fumbling for paperwork, no hurried explanations, no anxious energy. Just silence, measured and controlled. "License and registration," she snapped, her voice sharper than it needed to be. She wanted to see something crack in that composure. The man blinked once, slow and deliberate, before tilting his head slightly. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, polished, not a hint of fear. That landed like a pebble in still water, sending ripples of irritation through her. Most people didn't question her, not this early in a stop. They obeyed first, asked later. But he was testing her. She could feel it in the way he held her gaze, steady and unwavering. She crossed her arms, her fingers flexing against the fabric of her sleeves, and narrowed her eyes. Failed to signal back there. A beat passed. The air between them thickened, heavy with something unspoken. He exhaled quietly, almost a sigh, but not quite. "Did I?" he said, his tone flat, not quite argumentative, but probing. Tara's patience thinned. "License and registration," she repeated, harder this time. The man didn't flinch, didn't challenge her outright, but something in his expression shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for the glove compartment. She tensed, her muscles coiling as his fingers brushed the latch. The weight of her holster pressed against her hip, a familiar presence, a tool of control. He retrieved the documents with practiced ease, handing them over without a word. She snatched them from his grasp, her eyes flicking over the name printed on the license. Malcolm Evans. It meant nothing to her, not yet. "You live around here?" she asked, stepping closer, her shadow falling over him. His lips pressed together for the briefest moment before he replied, "I don't see how that's relevant." Her grip tightened on his ID, the plastic edges digging into her palm. She'd been on the force long enough to recognize when someone wasn't taking her seriously, long enough to spot the ones who thought they could skate by on charm, on status. This guy, with his fancy suit and steady hands, was one of them, and it lit a spark of frustration in her chest that she couldn't ignore. "Step out of the vehicle," she said, her voice low, leaving no room for argument. For the first time, his expression shifted. His jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Resignation? Crossing his face. He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Why?" The single word carried weight. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. "I asked you to step out," she said, stepping back, her hand hovering near her radio now, her heart thudding against her ribs. He didn't argue, didn't snap back. Just let out a long, slow breath, unbuckled his seatbelt with a soft click, and pushed the door open. As he stood, taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, his suit jacket falling perfectly into place, Tara felt the shift. The moment where she held the reins, where she could remind him who called the shots. "Hands on the trunk," she ordered. He paused for just a second, his eyes locking onto hers. Then he turned, placing his palms flat against the cool metal, his fingers splayed, the silver surface gleaming under the streetlights. Her pulse hammered now, a steady drumbeat in her ears. She stepped forward, pressing a hand against his back, guiding him down just enough to feel the resistance in his frame. He stiffened, a subtle flex of muscle under her palm, and something inside her snapped. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, her fist swung up, connecting with his jaw. A sharp, stinging crack echoed off the pier and into the night. He staggered, one hand slipping from the trunk, but he didn't fall, didn't cry out, just froze. His head jerked to the side, a thin line of blood trickling from his lip. The world went still. Tara stood there, knuckles throbbing, chest heaving, a rush of triumph surging through her veins. She had put him in his place, wiped that smug calm right off his face, or so she thought. Then he turned. Slowly, deliberately, his eyes met hers, cold, unyielding. And in that instant, a sharp, unmistakable chill crawled up her spine. "You'll regret that, officer." His voice was low, steady, cutting through her like a blade. She smirked, masking the flicker of unease gnawing at her ribs. "Get back in your car," she barked, tossing his ID onto the driver's seat. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, just wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, staining his pristine cuff, and slid into the SUV. The engine purred to life. Tara watched his taillights fade into the night, the fish market stench curling around her, her fist still clenched. She had handled it. Just another night keeping Jacksonville in line. But deep in her gut, something twisted. A splinter of doubt, sharp and unrelenting. That look in his eyes, that voice, it wasn't fear, it wasn't defeat. It was something else, something bigger, and it left her wondering, just for a second, if she had misread the game entirely. Part 2. The shocking realization, who she really hit. Tara Mitchell leaned back in her cruiser, the glow of streetlights flickering through her windshield, casting long, jagged shadows across the dashboard. The air in Jacksonville was thick with humidity, suffocating even at midnight, clinging to her skin like a second layer of clothing. She should have been heading home by now, shaking off the tension of her shift with a cold beer and the hum of late-night television. But she couldn't get the look in his eyes out of her head. The black man in the charcoal suit. Malcolm Evans. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles aching. She had been so sure of herself when she stopped him. She had been sure that she saw the entitlement in his posture, the defiance in the way he questioned her authority. That moment when her fist connected with his jaw had been satisfying, a sharp exclamation point to the unspoken message she had wanted to deliver. You don't get to act like you own the place. But now, as she sat alone in the cruiser, engine idling, radio crackling with static, a different sensation crept into her chest. She had expected anger from him, expected an outburst, some desperate attempt to assert dominance. But he hadn't given her that. He hadn't given her anything. His silence had unsettled her. She told herself that it didn't matter, that she had handled it the way she always did. With control, with force when necessary, with the unwavering confidence of someone who understood what it took to maintain order. And yet, as the hours stretched and the weight of the humid night pressed down on her, she felt something shift. Her radio crackled to life. "Mitchell, report to the precinct. Chief wants you in his office." Her stomach twisted. The old chief had retired a month ago. She hadn't even met the new guy yet, just heard whispers in the department that he was the kind of leader who wanted to clean things up. She had dismissed it. She had been on the force for 15 years. She knew how things worked. Still, something about the way the dispatcher's voice had tightened at the end made her uneasy. She pulled into the precinct parking lot, her cruiser rolling to a slow stop under the harsh fluorescent lights. The familiar sight of officers milling around inside the bullpen, their voices carrying through the open windows, usually filled her with a sense of belonging. Not tonight. As she walked through the front doors, she could feel the shift in the air, the way conversations quieted, how glances flickered toward her before quickly darting away. She forced herself to ignore it, squared her shoulders, and made her way down the hallway toward the chief's office. The name on the door stopped her cold. Chief Malcolm Evans. Her breath stalled in her throat. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she stared at the gold lettering on the frosted glass, her brain scrambling to make sense of it. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't the same Malcolm Evans. Maybe she was overthinking. But deep down, she knew. The moment she pushed open the door, it was confirmed. He sat behind the desk, his suit still perfectly pressed, the same composed expression on his face, though now there was a faint bruise blooming along his jaw. Her mark, a reminder of what she had done. For the first time in her career, Tara felt unsteady on her feet. He looked up from a stack of papers, his gaze locking onto hers like a blade pressing against her throat. "Officer Mitchell," he said smoothly, his voice unreadable. "Close the door." She hesitated, just for a second, before stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. The sound felt final, like a cell door slamming shut. She forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to keep her posture straight, her face impassive. "Sir," she said, defaulting to protocol. A slow, deliberate silence stretched between them. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a case file he was deciding how to handle. She had been in countless interrogations before. She knew how to sit under scrutiny. But this was different. "You assaulted a man during a routine traffic stop tonight," he finally said, his tone even, controlled. She swallowed, her mouth dry. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't lie." She exhaled sharply through her nose. He was disrespectful. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Disrespectful. He repeated the word like it was a foreign concept. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell, at what point did he become a threat?" She knew this game, knew how to spin her reasoning into something justifiable. "He resisted my commands." Malcolm tilted his head. "Did he?" Her skin felt too tight. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say that she had followed procedure, that she had read the situation correctly, that she had acted in the best interest of maintaining control. But for the first time in her career, the words wouldn't come. Because he was looking at her like he could see through every single one of them. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached into a folder and pulled out a sheet of paper, sliding it across the desk toward her. "Your record." Her stomach clenched. She didn't have a bad record. Sure, she had some complaints, but every cop who worked as long as she had got them. Most of them were dismissed. But as she skimmed the list, her stomach twisted tighter. There were more than she remembered, more than she thought had been kept on file. A pattern, excessive force, intimidation tactics, several of them involving black men. She lifted her eyes, heat crawling up her neck. "This is bullshit," she muttered. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "No, Officer Mitchell," he said, voice calm but cold. "What's bullshit is the fact that you think this department will keep looking the other way." She clenched her jaw. "I was doing my job." "No," he said simply. "You were doing whatever you thought you could get away with." The words landed like a slap. For the first time in her career, she didn't have control of the room. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk, his bruised jaw a quiet reminder that he could have pressed charges, that this could have already ended differently for her. "You're off the streets," he said, effective immediately. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. "What?" "You're on desk duty until further notice." Her stomach dropped. "That's not... It's final." Her fists curled at her sides. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had spent 15 years building her career, earning her authority. She wasn't going to be sidelined over one damn stop. She wanted to argue, wanted to fight. But Malcolm just leaned back, his expression impassive. "You can go now." Her mouth opened, then shut. She turned, her hands shaking as she gripped the door handle. Her reputation, her authority, her control. In one night, it had all been taken away, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before. Fear. Part 3. The leak that ignites a firestorm. Tara Mitchell sat at her desk in the precinct, her fingers gripping the edges of a manila folder so tightly that the paper began to crumple. The room around her was alive with the usual morning chaos. Phones ringing, officers chatting over stale coffee, the distant hum of dispatch radio calls crackling through the speakers. But none of it registered. None of it cut through the simmering rage boiling in her chest. She had spent 15 years on this force, building a name for herself, earning the kind of respect that didn't come easy in a city like Jacksonville. She had weathered storms, faced down criminals, and made sure her authority was never questioned. And now? Now she was stuck behind a desk, reduced to paperwork and mundane tasks, sidelined like some rookie who had screwed up their first week on the job. All because of him, Malcolm Evans. The name felt like a knife in her ribs every time she thought about it. He had taken everything from her in a single night. Not just her position, but her sense of control, her ability to walk into a room and know that people would fall in line. She had hit him, and he had hit back harder, not with fists, but with power. And that was what scared her the most. Power. Real power. She had always thought she had it, that her badge, her rank, the weight of her years on the force gave her the final say. But sitting in that office, staring into Malcolm's eyes as he stripped her of her authority, she realized something chilling. She had never been the one in control. He was. And now, he was watching. She could feel it. Every time she stepped into the bullpen, she felt the weight of his presence pressing down on her, an invisible force that made her skin crawl. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to look at her a certain way. Just the knowledge that he was there, sitting behind his desk in that corner office, was enough to remind her that this wasn't over. The whispers had started almost immediately. The moment she stepped back onto the floor, every conversation seemed to hush just a little when she walked by. She had always been respected here, or feared at the very least. But now the looks weren't the same. Some were cautious, others amused, as if they were waiting to see just how far she would fall. She could handle the gossip. She had handled worse. But what she couldn't handle was the waiting. The sense that something bigger was coming, that this wasn't just about desk duty, that Malcolm was playing a longer game, and she wasn't about to let him win. She slammed the folder shut and stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. She needed to do something, anything to claw her way back from this. She wasn't going to sit here like a damn prisoner, watching her career crumble around her. She strode toward the break room, needing a moment to clear her head. But as she stepped inside, she caught the tail end of a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Chief Evans?" "Yeah." He was a federal investigator before this. Guys cleaned up departments in 3 cities already. Tara froze. The voice belonged to Jake Torres, a rookie she had worked with for the past 6 months. He had always been a little too eager, a little too naive. But right now, he was talking about something he shouldn't be. "Wait, what do you mean cleaned up departments?" another officer asked. Jake lowered his voice, but Tara still heard him. "I mean exactly that. He doesn't just show up and make policy changes. He digs, finds the rot and cuts it out. Corrupt cops, bad leadership. He exposes them, gets them fired, sometimes even prosecuted. And the scary part? He doesn't miss." Tara's stomach lurched. She had assumed Malcolm was just another bureaucrat, some politician type who had worked his way up through the ranks with a good smile and the right connections. But if Jake was right, if Malcolm wasn't just a chief, but this kind of chief, then she was in more trouble than she had thought, because she had history. She hadn't been reckless, at least not in a way that could be easily traced. She had been smart, careful. But if Malcolm was looking, really looking, she swallowed hard, pushing down the sudden rise of panic in her throat. Number. She couldn't let this get to her. She had built her reputation on being tough, on handling situations head-on. If Malcolm wanted a fight, she would give him one. She squared her shoulders, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the break room. She wasn't going to sit around waiting for him to make the next move. She was going to get ahead of it. By the time she reached her desk, she already had a plan forming. She knew people who had been on the force longer than Malcolm, people who wouldn't take kindly to some outsider coming in and changing the way things were run. If she could start planting doubts, turning the right heads, making it seem like Malcolm was the problem, not her, then maybe, just maybe, she could shift the narrative. She needed allies, she needed leverage, and most of all, she needed dirt on Malcolm Evans. She spent the rest of the afternoon combing through records, looking for anything that could be used against him. A misstep, an old case with loose ends, a questionable decision that could be spun into a scandal. But there was nothing. It was almost like he had been clean his entire career, which meant one of two things. Either he was as perfect as he pretended to be, or he was even smarter than she had given him credit for. Her frustration built with every dead end. It wasn't fair. How could he have nothing in his past while her mistakes were sitting right there in a folder on his desk? Her jaw clenched as she realized the cold, hard truth. Malcolm wasn't just playing the game better than her. He had already won. Because the second he stepped into this precinct, he had known exactly who she was. He had known about her record, her reputation, her history, and instead of coming for her immediately, he had waited. Let her make the first move. Let her reveal exactly how far she was willing to go to maintain control. And now he was in control, and she was just another name on his list. She exhaled sharply, shoving her chair back and standing up. This wasn't over. She had been knocked down before. She had fought her way through worse, and she wasn't about to let some bureaucrat with a clean record walk into her city and erase her. If Malcolm wanted a war, he was going to get one. Because there was one thing she still had, one thing that had kept her standing through 15 years of this job. She didn't quit. Part 4. Internal Affairs and the Ticking Clock. Tara Mitchell sat in her car, the leather of the steering wheel slick under her grip as she stared at the precinct doors. The weight in her chest had settled deep, a stone she couldn't shake loose. The whispers had grown louder, the glances sharper, and now, after 15 years on the force, she felt something she had never felt before. Isolation. She had spent her career believing in her authority, in the untouchable nature of her badge. She had enforced the law with an iron will, ensured that control was never pried from her hands. But now, sitting here with the events of the past few weeks unraveling like a slow-motion train wreck, she saw the truth she had ignored for far too long. She wasn't the one in control. She never had been. Malcolm Evans had dismantled everything she had built with nothing more than patience. He hadn't needed to throw a punch. He hadn't needed to yell, to threaten, to posture. He had watched, waited, and let her destroy herself. And now she was the problem. It had started with the demotion, desk duty, a slap on the wrist that should have been temporary. But then came the whispers, the subtle shifts in body language. Officers who had once laughed at her jokes now avoided her eyes. The rookies, once eager to be in her orbit, kept their distance. Conversations halted when she entered a room, and worst of all, the people she had counted as allies had begun to disappear. Her partner, Jake Torres, had been the first. She had always considered Jake loyal. He had followed her lead on the streets, trusted her judgment. But after Malcolm's arrival, something had changed. At first, it was small. Hesitation where there had been none before, unease that lingered in his shoulders whenever she spoke. Then, the betrayal came. The dashcam footage. She hadn't even remembered the conversation, one of 100 venting sessions after a long shift. But Malcolm had it. And when he played it back, with Jake sitting across from her in that suffocating conference room, she felt the walls close in. Her own words, sharp, biting, laced with venom. They think they own the damn city. They need to learn their place. And just like that, she was branded. Not just an officer with a questionable record, but a racist. Her stomach clenched at the memory of it. The way Jake had refused to meet her eyes. The way Malcolm had leaned back in his chair, calm, deliberate. You did this to yourself. He hadn't needed to say it out loud. It was written in every controlled movement, every flick of his gaze, and she had played right into his hands. The backlash had been immediate. The story leaked. The press had a field day. And within hours, a petition had surfaced, demanding her removal from the force. She had told herself it would blow over, that she had survived worse. But then came the real test. The crowd. She had faced angry citizens before. It came with the job, but never like this. Never with their rage directed squarely at her. The precinct steps had been flooded with protesters, signs flashing, voices raised in fury. She had walked through them with her head high, her uniform stiff, her badge gleaming under the harsh Florida sun. And they had thrown bricks. One caught her shoulder, sending pain lancing through her bones. Another struck the pavement at her feet, shattering into jagged shards of glass. But she hadn't faltered. She had stood tall, forced herself not to flinch as the chants grew deafening. Fire her! Fire her now! Her lips had curled into a smirk, a defiant shield against the rising tide. Let them scream. Let them throw their bricks. She wasn't going anywhere. Or so she had thought. But then Malcolm had called her in. The meeting had been short. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't gloated. He had simply placed a suspension notice in front of her, fingers drumming lightly against the desk as he waited for her to pick it up. 60 days, unpaid. Her chest had tightened, her pride warring with the sinking dread in her gut. This is bullshit. Your words, Malcolm had replied, cool as ever. Your consequences. She had wanted to fight it, wanted to storm out of that office and tell every single one of those protesters exactly where they could shove their petitions. But she knew. She knew. If she pushed back too hard, Malcolm wouldn't just suspend her. He would bury her. And so, she had signed. She had walked out of that office with her head still high, her heart still pounding with unspent rage. She had told herself it wasn't over, that she would find a way back, that 60 days was nothing. But then the paint came. Racist pig. Scrawled across her locker in dripping red letters, the message stark, brutal, undeniable. She had stood there, staring at it, feeling the weight of the words settle over her like chains. And the whispers. Oh, the whispers. She's done. They're never letting her back. She had it coming. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Because deep down, she knew they were right. She had spent her career believing she was untouchable. That no matter how many times she bent the rules, no matter how many times she pushed the line, she would always be protected. Because that was how the system worked, wasn't it? It protected people like her. Until it didn't. Until someone like Malcolm Evans walked in and changed the rules. She had played the game too long, leaned too hard into the power she thought was hers. And now, The same system she had once wielded like a weapon had turned against her. And the worst part? Malcolm didn't have to do a damn thing. He had just let her own actions do the work for him. She exhaled sharply, her fingers loosening their death grip on the steering wheel. This wasn't over. Not yet. She still had cards to play. Because while Malcolm Evans might have had patience, she had survival instincts. And if she was going down, she was going to take him with her. Her jaw clenched as she reached for her phone, her fingers dialing a number she hadn't used in years. The line clicked, and a voice answered on the other end. "Tara, what the hell are you calling me for?" She smiled, the fire rekindling in her chest. "I need a favor." And just like that, the war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Part 5. The betrayal that changes everything. Tara Mitchell sat alone in her dimly lit motel room, the scent of burnt fabric and stale beer lingering in the air. Her apartment had been reduced to ash, the flames still flickering in her mind as vividly as they had that night. The note, scrawled in black soot across what remained of her front door, echoed in her thoughts like a death knell. "Next time, you burn." Her ribs ached from the beating at the warehouse, her lips still swollen from the brick thrown during the protests, and now, the last remnant of stability in her life had been incinerated. She had no badge, no home, and barely any money left. Malcolm had taken everything. She had spent years believing she was the one with power, the one who dictated the rules, who determined the winners and losers of every situation. She had thought the badge gave her that authority. But now, stripped of everything, she understood the truth. Power was never about the badge. It was about control. And Malcolm had controlled this game from the start. She exhaled sharply, staring at the flickering motel sign through the dirty window, her fingers gripping the edges of her thin blanket. She had always known how to hit first, how to take control before someone else could. It had been her weapon in every situation, asserting dominance, ensuring no one questioned her authority. But Malcolm? Malcolm had taught her the power of patience. He had let her destroy herself, let her think she was winning, let her believe she had the upper hand right up until the moment she realized she was already in the noose. He had made her fight for every scrap of ground, had let her taste victory only to rip it away at the last second. And now, he had taken the final piece of her life, her home. For the first time in her life, Tara wasn't just fighting to win, she was fighting to survive. She pushed herself off the bed, her body protesting every movement, but she ignored it. She couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Not when Malcolm was still standing, untouched, untouchable. But that was about to change. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She had one last move left, one final card to play. It wasn't clean. It wasn't legal. But nothing about this war had been fair. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The line clicked, and a voice answered on the other end. "Tara, what the hell are you calling me for?" She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "I need a favor." The next morning, she was sitting across from Luis Hernandez, a reporter known for dragging skeletons out of closets and setting them on fire for the world to see. He was the type who thrived on scandal, the kind of journalist Malcolm had spent years keeping at arm's length. Tara slid a flash drive across the table, her eyes locked onto Luis's. "I need you to take him down." Luis picked it up, weighing it between his fingers before raising an eyebrow. "And what exactly am I looking at here?" She leaned forward, voice low, steady. A trail of money, bribes, a cover-up from years ago when Malcolm was just a deputy. It's all there. The deals he made, the people he silenced. You expose this, and he's finished. Luis let out a slow whistle, his eyes scanning her bruised face, the exhaustion etched into her features. "You sure about this? Once I run this story, there's no coming back." Tara's jaw tightened. "There's nothing left for me to go back to." Luis nodded, slipping the flash drive into his pocket. "Then let's burn this to the ground." The story hit the internet like a grenade. Within hours, Malcolm Evans's name was trending. The scandal reached every major news outlet, and by the evening, The first wave of protests had shifted, no longer demanding Tara's badge, but Malcolm's. She sat in her motel room, watching the news coverage with a cold sense of satisfaction. This was it. This was what victory looked like. Malcolm was drowning in the very fire he had set for her, and for the first time since this war began, she could breathe. But then the phone rang. She answered, expecting Luis, expecting a reporter, expecting anyone who would confirm that Malcolm was finally being dragged down into the dirt where he belonged. Instead, it was Ellen. Her sister's voice was tight, shaking. "Tara, they came to the house." Her breath hitched. "What? Who?" "The cops. They—" Her voice cracked. "They found drugs in my basement." Tara shot to her feet, heart hammering. "That's not possible." "They said they got a tip, that someone called it in." "Tara, I don't even—" The realization struck like a sledgehammer. Malcolm. She had made her move. She had burned his name to the ground. And this was his answer. She had lost her home. Now he was taking her family. She gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "Ellen, listen to me. Don't say anything. I'll fix this." Her sister was crying now, the sound tearing through Tara's chest like barbed wire. "How, Tara? You're not a cop anymore. You can't fix this." But Tara had stopped listening, because she already knew what she had to do. She hung up, snatching her jacket off the chair, her mind already forming a plan, her body moving on instinct. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. Malcolm thought he could break her, but he had just made his last mistake. Because there was one thing he had underestimated about Tara Mitchell. She didn't stop fighting until there was nothing left to lose. Part 6. Blood on the Pavement. A message she can't ignore. Tara Mitchell hunched forward on the hospital bed, her arm trapped in a sling, the sterile white walls closing in around her. A faint medicinal smell filled the room, mingling with the scent of sweat and blood she hadn't quite managed to wash off. Her entire body ached from the sniper's bullet, and the rough cuffs that had bitten into her wrists as they hauled her from the dock. The weight of failure pressed heavily on her chest. She had been so certain she'd won. She had forced Malcolm Evans into a confession, live-streamed his admission to countless viewers. She had thought that was the final, triumphant blow. But now, sitting in that cold room with the beep of a heart monitor and a guard's unyielding gaze from the doorway, she couldn't escape the truth. The fight wasn't over. She hadn't truly won. And Malcolm still had his hand firmly on the wheel. The red light of her stream had been a beacon, a desperate attempt to turn the tide after all he'd taken from her. He'd framed her. He'd burned her home. He'd tarnished her reputation until she was a shadow of the officer she'd once been. When she grabbed Jamal, his son, and dragged Malcolm into that dockside confrontation, it felt like a final move, the one that would end the nightmare. But the dream of victory had lasted only a moment. The SWAT team arrived, and before she could press her advantage, they were cuffing her, shouting her down, taking her weapon. Even then, she'd thought the confession would stand. It was public. It was undeniable. But Malcolm had planned for this, just as he'd planned for everything. The system protected its own. Her attempt at justice became another mark against her record, another crime to add to the long list he'd pinned on her back. She wasn't the hero of this story. She wasn't even the underdog. She was the villain, and Malcolm was writing the script. Now, she felt the weight of every choice she'd made bearing down on her. She had always believed she could force control over the chaos around her. She had been an officer, after all, 15 years on the force, and she knew how to assert authority, how to make others respect her. But authority had never been the same as power. Malcolm had shown her that. He hadn't won by shouting orders or brandishing a badge. He'd won by waiting, watching, and striking when the moment was perfect. She hated him for it. She hated how much she'd underestimated him, how deeply he'd undermined her every move. No matter how far she pushed, he always seemed one step ahead, dismantling her victories, turning her triumphs to ash. Her sister, Ellen, was still locked up. The drugs found in Ellen's basement, a setup clearly, but a devastating one, had ripped away Tara's last shred of stability. That attack on her family had shaken her more than anything else. If Malcolm was willing to go after Ellen, was willing to frame her own blood to keep her silent, then he would never stop. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving she was right or regaining her reputation. It was about survival, about finding a way to stop him before he erased her completely. She stared at her hand, the one that had clenched around that revolver on the dock, the one she had pointed at Malcolm's son. The memory of that moment burned in her mind. How Jamal had trembled under the gun, how Malcolm had stepped forward, calm, composed, offering his confession like it was a chess move he knew would win the game. She'd felt the rush of power, the certainty that she had him, that she could finally put an end to his reign. And then, like every time before, he turned it against her. She had walked into his trap once again. The guard shifted by the door, and Tara looked up. Her reflection in the small, reinforced window was pale and haggard. The dark circles under her eyes, the jagged scar from the sniper's bullet. These were the marks of a war she never expected to fight, never thought she could lose. She had imagined that wearing a badge meant something. That justice was more than just an idea, but Malcolm had shown her otherwise. Justice wasn't real. It was a construct, a fragile web of beliefs that could be torn apart by someone willing to pull the right strings. And Malcolm had all the strings. Her body ached for rest, but her mind refused to stop racing. The painkillers dulled the sharpest edges of her wounds, but nothing could numb the growing realization that she was running out of moves. She had no home, no family, no allies left. Her sister's arrest had been the final blow that severed her from any support she once had. Tara had always been a fighter, always prided herself on standing tall no matter what came her way. But now she was beginning to understand what it felt like to be broken. Not just physically, but utterly and completely broken. She closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe through the rage and the despair. There had to be something she hadn't seen yet, a piece of the puzzle she could still put in place. She couldn't let him win, not completely, not after everything he'd taken from her. She couldn't let Malcolm Evans be the one to define her story, to decide her fate. There had to be a way to hit back, to force him to face the consequences of what he'd done. But every time she thought she had the answer, he slipped out of her grasp. It was like chasing shadows in the dark. Tara leaned back against the thin hospital pillow, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. Her breath was steady now, the pain a dull throb rather than a sharp, searing burn. She thought of Ellen. She thought of her sister's tear-streaked face, the betrayal in her voice when the drugs were found. Malcolm's face swam into her mind next. That calm smirk, that steady gaze that told her he knew exactly how this would end. He wasn't worried. He never was. Because he believed in his own untouchable power. That was what made him so dangerous. He didn't need to play by the rules. He didn't need to yell or threaten or push. He just had to sit back and wait. And she hated him for it. But hate wouldn't win this. Revenge wouldn't either. She'd tried both, and look where it had gotten her. She was bruised, bleeding, and utterly alone. If she wanted to beat Malcolm Evans, she would have to think like him. She would have to learn patience, learn to watch, learn to strike when it mattered most. It wouldn't be a fair fight. It never had been. But she had to believe she could find a way. Because the alternative was letting him erase her completely, and that was something she couldn't accept. She felt a new resolve hardening inside her, a faint spark of the defiance she thought she'd lost. It wasn't a plan yet. It wasn't a strategy. But it was something. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough. She would figure out her next move. She would find the weak point in his armor. And when she did, she would make sure he knew what it felt like to lose everything. Tara Mitchell didn't know when or how, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Not ever. Part 7. A setup. She can't escape. Tara Mitchell sat hunched on the edge of her sister's lumpy couch, the weak light of the room casting long, uneven shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Her ribs ached beneath the tape that still bound them. the deep bruises from the mob's bats serving as a constant reminder of the beating she'd barely survived. The faint scab on her split lip stung every time she moved her mouth, but that pain was nothing compared to the gnawing sense of failure that settled like a weight on her chest. She had come to Ellen's house thinking it was a refuge, a place to regroup after everything had fallen apart. Instead, it had become the stage for yet another blow she hadn't seen coming. It had been 3 days since the police swarmed Ellen's house. The memory was still vivid, the lights flashing in the pre-dawn darkness, the officers pouring out of their cruisers like a flood. Tara could still hear Ellen's screams as they dragged her to the ground, could still see the panic and confusion in her sister's eyes. The planted drugs were undeniable, hidden where they would be easily found, in a place Ellen never would have put them. Tara's protests had been ignored, her accusations dismissed as desperate attempts to shift blame. She wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that her sister had been framed so blatantly, or the knowledge that Malcolm Evans was behind it all. That smug look he had given her from across the street as Ellen was hauled away still burned in her mind. Ellen was more than just family. She was the last solid thing Tara had left. After losing her badge, her home, and even the last shreds of her reputation, Ellen's support had been her anchor. They had grown up together, looked out for each other when times were tough. Ellen had been there when Tara first put on her uniform, had celebrated her promotion to sergeant, had even been the one to help her clean out her apartment after the fire that Malcolm's minions had set. But now Ellen was gone too, swept away by a tidal wave of corruption that Tara felt powerless to stop. Tara leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees and dropping her face into her hands. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. She had told herself after the dock confrontation that things couldn't get worse, that she'd already hit rock bottom. But Malcolm kept finding new ways to push her lower. The attack on Ellen was his most personal strike yet. It wasn't just about hurting Tara. It was about isolating her, cutting her off from anyone who could help. Without Ellen, without the reassurance that someone still believed in her, Tara felt adrift. Her mind churned with half-formed plans, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe she could gather evidence, find some way to expose the planted drugs. But Malcolm had already shown he could cover his tracks better than anyone. The police had taken his side at every turn. Even the supposed whistleblowers she'd contacted had gone silent, likely paid off or threatened into submission. Tara had no connections left, no leverage. She felt like she was drowning in quicksand, each move only pulling her deeper into the muck. And yet, despite everything, a small ember of defiance still burned within her. She had spent her entire life fighting for respect, for justice, for a place in a world that often seemed determined to shut her out. The idea of giving up, of letting Malcolm win without a final battle, was unbearable. She wasn't sure what her next move would be, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let this be the end of her story. Not after everything he'd done. Not after what he'd done to Ellen. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped her out of her thoughts. Tara stiffened, instinctively reaching for the revolver she had tucked beneath one of the couch cushions. Her fingers closed around the cold metal as she listened, her breath shallow. The car door slammed, followed by footsteps on the porch. She held her breath, waiting. The footsteps paused, then receded back toward the car. The engine started again, and the vehicle pulled away. Tara exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. She set the gun back down and leaned her head against the back of the couch, staring at the stained ceiling. The paranoia was getting to her. She couldn't stay here much longer. If Malcolm had targeted Ellen, it was only a matter of time before he sent someone to finish the job. And then what? Where would she go? Who could she trust? The embers of defiance flickered as doubt crept in. What was the point of fighting if every step forward just led to another ambush, another betrayal? But she couldn't let herself think that way. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. Ellen needed her, even if Ellen didn't know it. Tara had to find a way to clear her sister's name, to expose the frame job for what it was. That meant staying one step ahead of Malcolm, outmaneuvering him the way he had outmaneuvered her at every turn. It wouldn't be easy. It might even be impossible. But Tara had built her entire career on making the impossible happen. She had survived the streets of Jacksonville for 15 years as a cop, had risen through the ranks despite the whispers and the doubts. She hadn't done it by running away. She had done it by standing her ground, by refusing to back down even when the odds were against her. Tara stood and walked to the window, peering out at the empty driveway. She could feel the weight of the revolver pressing against her side, a cold reminder of how much had changed. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Ellen, for the life her sister had built, for the trust and loyalty that had been a constant in her chaotic world. Malcolm had taken so much already. She couldn't let him take this too. She turned away from the window and began pacing the room, her mind racing. She would have to be smart about this. No more impulsive moves, no more desperate stunts that left her exposed. If she was going to take Malcolm down, she needed a plan. Something solid, something he wouldn't see coming. It might take time. It might mean walking a path she never wanted to walk. But she was prepared to do whatever it took. The ticking clock seemed louder now, each second a reminder that time was running out. Tara clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly how she would beat him yet, but she knew she would. Because as long as she was still breathing, as long as she could still stand, she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not for herself, not for Ellen, not for anyone who had ever believed in her. Part 8. Beaten, bailed, and a plan to strike back. Tara Mitchell sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, the flickering neon sign outside casting an eerie red glow against the peeling wallpaper. The Jacksonville night was humid, thick with the scent of asphalt and desperation. 3 days had passed since Ellen was arrested. 3 days since Malcolm Evans had delivered his cruelest blow yet. Every time Tara closed her eyes, she saw her sister's face, streaked with tears, eyes wild with betrayal, pleading as they shoved her into the squad car. That moment had been worse than the beatings, worse than the fire, worse than the public humiliation. It had cut through her, straight to the core of whatever was left of her humanity. She had lost everything already, her badge, her home, her career, her reputation. But Ellen? That was supposed to be untouchable. Family was the one thing that was supposed to be safe. She had believed, foolishly, that Malcolm wouldn't take it that far, that he would let her sister be, that his vendetta was only against her. But she had underestimated him again, and now Ellen was locked in a holding cell, facing a drug charge that would stick because Malcolm had ensured there would be enough evidence to make it airtight. Tara's hands shook as she ran them through her tangled hair. The motel was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the muffled sound of traffic on the highway. The weight of it all pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her in a way that even the most brutal beatings hadn't. Because this wasn't about her anymore. This was about someone who had nothing to do with the war she had started. Malcolm had made sure Tara knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless. He had torn away the last piece of her life that had still meant something. For the first time in weeks, Tara felt truly alone. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the dim screen flashing an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her voice hoarse from too many nights of sleepless rage. "Yeah." A familiar voice crackled through the line. "Mitchell." It was Kessler, her lawyer. His voice was low, cautious. "I've been digging." She sat up, muscles coiling tight. "And?" "I found something. It's not much, but it's a start." He hesitated. "You were right about Malcolm. He's got dirt buried deep, but there's a trail. A bribery scandal from 10 years ago when he was still a deputy. It was hushed up before he got promoted, but there's a paper trail." Tara's heart pounded. A lead. A real, tangible lead. "Can you prove it?" Kessler sighed. "I can't get enough to bring him down. Not yet. But I can get it in front of someone who can." Tara clenched her jaw. Time. She needed more time. But Ellen didn't have time. She could already picture her sister sitting in that cell, terrified, waiting for a trial that would never be fair. "I need to hit him now," she muttered. "I need to take him out before he does anything worse." Kessler was silent for a beat. "Tara, this is dangerous. You're already walking on the edge. If you go after him without proof, real proof, you're going to lose." Tara let out a bitter laugh. "I've already lost." But even as she said it, something inside her shifted, because the truth was, she wasn't done. Not yet. Malcolm wanted her to break, to surrender, to disappear into the wreckage of her own destruction, and for a moment, she had almost let him win. But as she sat in that dingy motel room, staring at the cracked ceiling, she realized something. She still had one thing left: the truth. Tara grabbed her phone and scrolled through the contacts. She found what she was looking for: Luis Mendoza, an investigative journalist from a local newspaper. He had been sniffing around Malcolm's department for months, chasing whispers of corruption but never able to land a solid story. If she gave him what Kessler had found, if she gave him a reason to dig deeper, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. She dialed, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her. Luis answered on the second ring. "Mitchell, I have a story for you," she said, her voice cold and determined. "And if you want to bring down the most corrupt cop in this city, you're going to want to hear it." The diner was nearly empty when Tara walked in, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Luis was already there, seated in a corner booth, a notepad and recorder set in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of intrigue and wariness. "Took you long enough," he said, motioning for her to sit. Tara slid into the booth and got straight to the point. "Malcolm Evans is dirty. Bribery, cover-ups, abuse of power. I can't prove all of it, but I can prove enough." Luis leaned forward. "What are we talking about?" She placed a flash drive on the table and pushed it toward him. "Bribery, 10 years ago. I have the names, the documents. It was buried when he got promoted, but the paper trail is still there." Luis picked up the drive, turning it between his fingers. "This could be enough to start something. But it won't take him down on its own." Tara met his gaze, her voice steel. "Then we keep digging." Luis studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's burn him down." For the first time in weeks, Tara felt something close to hope. The article dropped 2 days later. The headline was bold, damning. "A legacy of corruption, Chief Malcolm Evans and the bribery scandal they tried to bury." It spread fast, picked up by local news, then regional. The city was already on edge from Tara's previous allegations, from the fire, from the protests. This was gasoline on an open flame. By noon, Malcolm's office was swarmed with reporters. By evening, the mayor's office released a statement. By midnight, Tara sat in her motel room, watching the news, a cold beer in her hand, waiting for the fallout. Then her phone rang. She answered without thinking. "Yeah?" A low chuckle. "Malcolm." "Well played, Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "I didn't think you had it in you." Tara's grip on the phone tightened. "Your days are numbered." Malcolm laughed. "You think an article is enough to stop me? You think you won? You just made yourself a bigger target." The line went dead. Tara sat there, staring at the phone, her pulse hammering. The victory tasted bitter. She had landed a blow, but Malcolm wasn't out. Not yet. And if he had been ruthless before, now he was going to be something worse. She leaned back against the headboard, exhaling slowly. She had started something now, something bigger than herself, and she wasn't sure if she'd make it out alive. But she knew one thing. Neither was Malcolm. Part 9. The trap closes in, a journalist dies, and Tara is framed again. Tara Mitchell stood at the edge of the dock, the cool night air biting against her bruised skin as she gripped the revolver hidden beneath her jacket. The St. Johns River stretched out before her, dark and endless, the water lapping softly against the rusted metal beams of the abandoned pier. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. The bruises on her ribs from the beating, the sting of betrayal that still festered in her chest, the suffocating rage that had only grown since Ellen's arrest. But none of it compared to the hatred burning in her veins, a fire that only one thing could extinguish: Malcolm Evans. She had spent the past week hunting for a way to bring him down, following every lead, clawing at the edges of his perfect image, desperate to find a crack. And now, she had it. The documents Kessler had uncovered, the bank statements linking Malcolm to a known drug dealer, the transactions that told a story of a cop who had been dirty long before he had climbed his way to chief. It was proof. Maybe not enough to get him thrown in prison, but enough to light the first match. Enough to ruin him. And that was all she needed. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the grip of the gun as she glanced over her shoulder. The sound of tires crunching against gravel echoed through the empty lot, followed by the low rumble of an engine shutting off. He was here. She had sent him a message from a burner phone, a simple demand. Meet me at the docks. Midnight. No cops. No backup. Just you. She hadn't expected him to come alone. Malcolm wasn't stupid. But she also knew he wouldn't ignore it. Not when she held something that could destroy him. The headlights flicked off, leaving only the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the pavement. The driver's side door opened, and Malcolm stepped out, his posture as calm and composed as ever. He wore a dark suit, crisp and clean despite the grime of their surroundings, his every movement deliberate as he adjusted his cuffs and met her gaze. "Tara," he said smoothly, as if they were old friends meeting for a drink rather than enemies standing on the edge of war. "I have to admit, I didn't expect this. Not after your little stunt at the precinct." She didn't answer right away, watching him carefully, waiting for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. Malcolm was as unreadable as ever, his expression betraying nothing. "I have something you're going to want," she finally said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse pounded against her ribs. "And I'm giving you one chance to make this right." He raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his face. "That's so?" He took a slow step forward, hands still tucked neatly into his pockets. "And what exactly do you think you have that could change anything?" She pulled the folder from her jacket and tossed it onto the hood of his car. "Bank statements, transfers, ties to Sandoval. I know you were on his payroll before you ever put on that badge." For the first time, something shifted in Malcolm's expression, just a flicker, a brief tightening of his jaw. But it was enough. Tara took a step closer, her voice dropping to something colder, sharper. "It's over, Malcolm. You wanted to destroy me, and you did. I lost everything because of you. My career, my home, my family. But you didn't finish the job, and now I'm coming for you." He let out a slow breath, as if considering her words, then shook his head with a chuckle. "You still don't get it, do you?" His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, the amusement was gone. "You think you can take me down with a few bank statements? You think the system cares about some old drug money? Let me tell you something, Tara. You lost the second you threw that punch. You just didn't realize it yet." She felt the anger flare inside her, hot and suffocating, but she didn't let it show. Not yet. "Then why are you here?" she asked, tilting her head. "If I lost, why are you standing in front of me right now?" Malcolm smirked. "Because I'm curious. Because I wanted to see what was left of you after everything I did. And honestly," he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I'm a little disappointed." The words cut deeper than she expected. She had spent so long fighting, clawing her way through the wreckage he had left behind. And yet, standing here now, she realized something terrifying. He still wasn't afraid of her. She had come here expecting a battle, expecting to see the first crack in his mask. But Malcolm Evans wasn't a man who cracked. He wasn't a man who panicked. He was a man who planned, who anticipated every move before it happened. And suddenly it hit her. He had been waiting for this. The realization sent a cold chill down her spine, and before she could react, the sound of footsteps echoed through the lot. She barely had time to turn before a sharp pain exploded in the back of her head, sending her vision spinning. The world tilted, the dock blurring into nothing but a smear of darkness, and then she was on her knees, the taste of blood thick in her mouth. A second later, the folder was ripped from her hands. She forced herself to look up, blinking through the pain, and saw two men standing beside Malcolm. Cops, just like him, their faces blank, unreadable. Malcolm crouched in front of her, his voice quiet but sharp. "You never had a chance, Tara." He held up the folder, flipping through the pages before shaking his head. "You really thought I wouldn't see this coming?" She tried to move, tried to reach for the gun still tucked in her waistband, but another blow struck her ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. She collapsed onto her side, gasping, pain searing through her body. Malcolm sighed. "You're not the first person to try and take me down, and you won't be the last. But let me give you a little advice, since I'm feeling generous." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "If you want to beat someone like me, you don't come at me with evidence." He smiled. "You come at me with power." He stood, turning to his men. "Take care of her." The last thing Tara saw before the darkness swallowed her was the river stretching endlessly before her, cold and waiting. And then, everything went black. She woke up hours later, alone. The night was silent, the dock empty, the only proof that Malcolm had ever been there, the bruises blooming across her body. Her gun was gone. The folder was gone. Her last chance at revenge had slipped through her fingers. For the first time since this war had begun, she felt something close to defeat. But as she pushed herself up, wincing, forcing herself to stand, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't done. Not yet. She had been playing Malcolm's game, trying to beat him with his own rules. That was her mistake. She wouldn't make it again. Part 10. The Ultimate Stand, Kidnapping the Chief's Son. Tara Mitchell sat in the dimly lit motel room, the stale air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of damp carpet. The bruises on her ribs throbbed with every shallow breath, and the cut on her lip burned as she pressed an ice pack against it. She had spent the past few days licking her wounds, replaying that night at the docks over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment she had lost. The truth was, she had never been in control. Malcolm had let her think she had a chance, let her feel the rush of power, the belief that she could actually win, only to rip it away at the last second, just to watch her break. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. The phone on the bedside table buzzed, rattling against the cheap wood. She reached for it, her fingers shaking slightly as she swiped to read the message. "They're moving Ellen tomorrow. No bail, no appeal. She's gone unless you do something now." Tara's heart clenched. She knew this was coming, had felt it looming ever since Malcolm framed her sister. But seeing it in words, seeing the finality of it, sent a fresh wave of fury crashing through her. Ellen was the last thing she had left, the only person who had stood by her, believed in her when the world turned its back. And now, Malcolm was taking that too. She clenched her jaw, her mind racing. If she did nothing, Ellen would be swallowed by the system, lost in a maze of bureaucracy and false charges. And if she tried to fight it the legal way, it would take years, years she didn't have. Malcolm had made sure of that. Number. She couldn't play by the rules anymore. That was the mistake she had made all along. She needed to take this into her own hands. Her fingers hovered over the keypad before she typed out a reply. Where? A few minutes passed before another message came through. Federal holding. Downtown. 3rd floor. You have less than 24 hours. She exhaled sharply, her mind already spinning through 100 different scenarios. The building was locked down, impossible to breach without clearance. And even if she did manage to get inside, what then? There would be guards, security cameras, checkpoints. It was suicide. Unless... She grabbed a pen and a crumpled napkin from the nightstand, sketching out a rough map of the building from memory. She had been there before, years ago, back when she still had a badge and a future. There was a service entrance in the back, meant for maintenance workers. Less security, fewer cameras. If she could get in through there, she might have a shot. But she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Her stomach twisted at the thought of reaching out to anyone. After Jake's betrayal, after watching her so-called allies turn their backs on her one by one, she had stopped believing in the idea of loyalty. But there was one person left. One person who hadn't sold her out. Kessler. Her lawyer wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a friend. But he was the only one who had stuck by her when the walls started closing in. And more importantly, he had connections. She dialed his number, her grip tight on the phone as it rang once, twice. "Mitchell," he answered, his voice groggy. "Do you know what time it is?" "I need your help," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "They're moving Ellen. Tomorrow." A heavy sigh on the other end. "Tara, if they're transferring her, it's already too late. I've tried every—" "I'm not asking for legal help," she cut in. "I need access, codes, a way in." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken warnings. Then, finally, Kessler muttered, "You're serious. Dead serious." A low curse. "Damn it, Tara. You're going to get yourself killed." She almost laughed. If he only knew how many times she had already come close. "Can you do it or not?" she pressed. Another pause. Then begrudgingly, "Meet me in an hour." She was already on her feet before he finished speaking. The meet was in a parking garage on the outskirts of town, the air thick with gasoline and decay. Kessler leaned against the hood of his car, arms crossed, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. He held up a small flash drive. "This has everything you need," he said. "Blueprints, guard rotations, security clearances. But Tara—" His eyes locked onto hers, tired and sharp. "Once you do this, there's no coming back. You get caught and you disappear for good." She took the drive without hesitation. "I was never coming back." Kessler shook his head. "Then I guess this is goodbye." She turned, but his voice stopped her. "Tara," he said, "be careful." She didn't respond. The plan was simple in theory, impossible in execution. She waited until just past midnight, dressed in black, her hair tied back, face hidden beneath the shadow of a stolen security cap. The service entrance was unguarded, just like she had hoped. She swiped a stolen ID badge across the scanner, holding her breath as the red light blinked, then turned green. She was in. Her heart pounded as she slipped down the corridor, moving quickly but carefully. The building was silent, save for the occasional hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps. She followed the blueprint in her mind, turning left then right, weaving through hallways until she reached the stairwell. 3rd floor. She climbed, her breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. When she reached the landing, she pressed herself against the door, listening. Voices. 2 guards. She reached into her pocket, wrapping her fingers around the cool metal of the taser she had stolen earlier that night. No turning back now. She kicked the door open. The first guard barely had time to react before she drove the taser into his neck, his body convulsing before crumpling to the ground. The second lunged for his radio, but she was faster, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard enough to make him drop it. She slammed him against the wall, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, she grabbed the keycard from his belt and sprinted down the hall. Ellen's cell was at the end. She swiped the card. Nothing. "No, no, no," she hissed, swiping again. The lock beeped, but the door didn't budge. Then she heard it. Alarms. They knew. She turned, fists clenched, but it was too late. Flashlights blinded her, gun barrels aimed at her chest, and then a voice. Calm. Amused. "Took you long enough?" "Malcolm." He stepped forward, the guards parting for him like the Red Sea. Tara's fingers twitched toward the gun tucked in her waistband, but she didn't reach for it, because Malcolm was smiling. And that terrified her more than anything. "I knew you'd come for her," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "That's why I moved her an hour ago." The world tilted. "No," she breathed. "Oh yes," Malcolm said. "You played right into my hands. Again." She lunged, A gun cracked. Pain exploded in her side. And then, darkness. Tara woke up in a concrete cell, her wrists cuffed to the chair, the cold bite of metal cutting into her skin. Malcolm sat across from her, sipping a cup of coffee like they were old friends. "I told you," he said, setting the cup down with a quiet clink. "You lost the second you threw that punch." She met his gaze, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth, and smiled, because he didn't know. He didn't know about the second flash drive, or the security footage that was already being leaked. She might have lost tonight. But the war. Part 11. The moment she loses everything. Tara Mitchell sat motionless in the dimly lit interrogation room, her wrists bound to the steel table, the cuffs biting into her bruised skin. The sting from the gunshot wound in her side pulsed in time with her heartbeat, but she refused to show the pain. Malcolm Evans sat across from her, a smirk playing on his lips as he sipped his coffee with an infuriating air of control. His suit was crisp, his posture relaxed, as if he had already written the ending to this story. "You know, Tara," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel, "I have to give you credit. You never give up. Even when you're outmatched, outgunned, and cornered, you still think you can win." He shook his head, setting his cup down with a deliberate clink. "But tell me, what exactly was your plan? Did you really think you could just walk into a federal holding facility and waltz out with your sister?" Tara's fingers twitched, her nails digging into her palms as she held his gaze. She wouldn't let him see her falter, wouldn't let him think he had broken her. He had taken everything, her career, her home, her reputation, and now her last piece of family. But she wasn't done. Not yet. "I thought I'd at least make you sweat," she muttered, her voice hoarse but steady. Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "You know what I like about you, Mitchell? You're predictable. Always running headfirst into battle, thinking you can punch your way out of anything. That's why I knew you'd come for her. That's why she was never here." Tara's stomach twisted, but she kept her face neutral. She had already suspected as much when she'd been captured, but hearing him confirm it made her blood boil. She had walked into a trap, played directly into his hands. And now Ellen was gone. "Where is she?" she asked, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. Malcolm tapped his fingers against the table, feigning consideration. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere you'll never find her." Tara inhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. Malcolm thrived on power, on control. He wanted to see her panic, to see her crumble under the weight of his authority. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "You think you've won," she said, tilting her head slightly. "That you can just erase me like you erased everyone else who got in your way." A slow smile tugged at her lips. "But you're wrong." Malcolm's smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. He was good at masking his emotions, but she had spent enough time studying him to recognize the cracks. "See?" she continued, leaning forward as much as the cuffs would allow. "You're right about one thing. I am predictable. You knew I'd come for Ellen. You counted on it. But you never stopped to ask yourself why I was so reckless this time." His eyes narrowed. Tara grinned, the taste of blood still lingering on her tongue. "Because I wasn't trying to win this round. I was setting you up." Malcolm stiffened just slightly, but it was enough. "That guard rotation you fed me," she continued. "I leaked it. That little display of power you put on tonight, it's all on record. The moment you admitted to framing me, the moment you bragged about moving Ellen, every second of it was being streamed live." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. For the first time, Malcolm wasn't in control. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked the same confidence as before. Tara smiled wider, relishing the rare look of uncertainty on his face. "Am I? Go ahead. Check your phone. See how many headlines already have your name in them." He hesitated, just for a second. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His jaw tightened as he unlocked the screen, his eyes scanning the notifications. The smirk vanished, his hand clenched around the device. Son of a... Tara laughed, the sound raw and victorious. You should have known better, Malcolm. You taught me how to fight dirty. You should have realized that I'd learn from the best. Malcolm exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring as he shoved the phone back into his pocket. You think this changes anything? He snapped. A few headlines? A media frenzy? I'll survive this. I always do. Tara cocked her head. Maybe, but not this time. The door burst open before Malcolm could respond. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a crisp suit, held up a badge. Chief Evans, she said, her voice neutral but firm. You're under federal investigation for corruption, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. We need you to come with us. For the first time, Malcolm looked truly caught off guard. This is ridiculous, he snapped, standing up. Do you know who I am? The agent didn't flinch. Yes, and that's exactly why we're here. Tara watched as Malcolm was cuffed, the same way he had orchestrated her own downfall. He struggled, but it was useless. As he was led past her, he slowed, leaning in just enough to whisper, "This isn't over." Tara met his gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "No," she agreed. "It's just your turn to lose." And then he was gone. The room felt different now, lighter. The weight that had been pressing against her chest for so long was finally starting to lift. The female agent turned to her, her expression unreadable. "You're not exactly innocent in all of this, Mitchell," she said. Tara smirked. "Yeah, well, you can thank me later." The agent sighed, shaking her head before nodding to another officer. The cuffs around Tara's wrists were unlocked, and she exhaled in relief, rubbing at the red marks they left behind. "Your sister," the agent said. "We found her. She's safe." The words nearly knocked the air from her lungs. "Where is she?" "On her way here," the agent replied. "You'll see her soon." Tara swallowed hard, the fight finally draining from her muscles. It was over, really, truly over. She had spent so long clawing for justice, for revenge, for a way to beat Malcolm at his own game. And now, she had won. But as she sat there, her body aching, her mind exhausted, she realized something else. She had lost so much along the way. Her badge, her reputation, her trust in people. But she had her freedom, and for now that was enough. Part 12. The shocking ending. Malcolm falls, but at what cost? Tara Mitchell sat on the steps of the courthouse, the weight of the past year pressing into her bones. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement, painting the city in gold and amber, but she felt none of its warmth. The battle was over, or at least that's what the headlines said. Malcolm Evans had been taken down, his empire of corruption dismantled piece by piece, but the victory felt hollow in her chest. She had spent so long fighting, so long burning with the need to destroy him, that she had forgotten what life looked like without war. Her sister Ellen sat beside her, quiet but steady. The bruises on her wrists from the handcuffs had faded, but the scars ran deeper than that. They both bore the marks of Malcolm's revenge, of the system that had turned against them, of the choices Tara had made in desperation. "You should eat something," Ellen said, nudging her gently. Tara smirked, shaking her head. "Since when did you turn into the responsible one?" Ellen shrugged. "Since you decided to get yourself almost killed about 100 times over. Someone has to make sure you don't fall apart now that you don't have an enemy to chase." That was the problem, wasn't it? The chase. It had been everything. She had defined herself by the battle, by the need to outmaneuver Malcolm, to claw her way back from the grave he had tried to bury her in. And now, she had no badge, no home, no job, and no plan. "What happens next?" she asked, more to herself than to Ellen. Her sister sighed, stretching her legs out in front of her. "You get to decide that. For once, no one else is pulling the strings." Tara let the words settle in her chest. It should have felt freeing, but instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no parachute. She had spent so much time surviving that she had forgotten how to live. Across the street, a group of journalists were still camped outside the courthouse, waiting for another statement, another headline. The world wanted her to be a symbol, either of justice or of destruction, depending on which channel you watched. Some called her a hero, a fighter who exposed a corrupt system and brought down an untouchable man. Others called her reckless, dangerous, proof of why people like her didn't belong in power. She had stopped caring what they thought a long time ago, but the truth was, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. "You ever think about leaving?" Ellen asked, watching the same crowd of reporters. "Just starting over somewhere else?" Tara considered it. A new city, a new name, a clean slate. The idea was tempting, but it didn't sit right. She had spent too long fighting for a place in this city to walk away from it now. "Maybe," she admitted, "but not yet." Ellen nodded, understanding. "Then what?" Tara exhaled slowly. The fight was over, but the damage remained. There were people like Malcolm still out there, hidden in the cracks of the system, waiting for their chance to rise. And then, there were people like her, people who had been discarded, beaten down, left to rot in the margins. She wasn't the same person who had thrown that first punch, the cop who thought she was untouchable. She wasn't the desperate woman on the run, fists bloodied, rage burning her from the inside out. She was something else now, a survivor. She thought about Malcolm's last words to her, that smirk as they led him away. The way he had promised that none of this would matter, that the system would find a way to rebuild itself, with or without him. Maybe he was right. Maybe it would. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Tara pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the ache in her ribs, the exhaustion that clawed at her bones. She had spent too much time thinking about what she had lost. It was time to start thinking about what she could build. She turned to Ellen and smirked. "Let's go get something to eat. Then I've got work to do." Ellen arched a brow. "Work? You planning on getting a job?" Tara grinned, the first real smile she had felt in months. "Something like that." The reporters across the street perked up as she stepped off the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing, voices calling her name. She ignored them. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She was looking forward. Tara Mitchell's journey was never just about a single moment, a single fight, or a single enemy. It was about something much deeper, a battle that countless others have faced, one that stretches far beyond her own story. Her downfall began with a single act of power wielded carelessly, but her survival was forged through pain, loss, and resilience. What she endured was more than just personal vengeance. It was a brutal lesson in how power is protected, how justice is manipulated, and how the fight for truth is never easy. Through Tara's story, we are reminded that the system does not break just because one corrupt leader falls. Malcolm Evans may have been exposed, his empire may have crumbled, but the structure that allowed him to rise in the first place remains. Power like his is never held by just one man. It is embedded in policies, institutions, and the silent complicity of those who look away. Tara thought she could fight it with fists, then with fire, then with exposure. Each time she was met with retaliation stronger than the last. The truth is, the system does not yield to rage alone. It takes strategy, persistence, and an unshakable will to dismantle injustice at its core. Her journey also reveals the cost of standing up. Every battle took something from her. Her badge, her home, her safety, and almost her life. The price of challenging power is high, and not everyone who takes the fight survives. But despite everything, she never surrendered to silence. She lost nearly everything, but she found something even more valuable: the knowledge that justice isn't about winning every battle, but refusing to accept defeat. This story is not just about Tara, nor is it just about Malcolm. It is about a cycle that has played out for generations, where those who speak up are silenced, those who resist are punished, and those who demand accountability are met with force. But history has shown us that even the most powerful systems can be challenged. The voices of the unheard can rise. The weight of truth, when wielded with persistence, can shake the very foundation of oppression. Tara's fight may be over, but the fight for justice continues. Her story is a call to action for those who have ever been silenced, for those who have ever felt powerless, for those who refuse to accept injustice as the norm. Change does not come from waiting. It comes from standing up, from refusing to look away, from challenging the structures that were designed to keep power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the fight for justice, then don't let this conversation end here. Share this story. Keep speaking up. Keep demanding change. And if you want to hear more stories that expose the truth, challenge corruption, and fight for civil rights, subscribe to CivilRightsFight, because the battle isn't over, and together we will not be silenced.